Hi, I'm John Nunn, and this video is going to be a little bit different to the previous ones. In earlier Gambit videos I've talked about recently published books, and these videos have been quite well received, but I've also got a few requests for videos about some of our older books. So I've chosen 6 of our earlier titles, and I'd just like to tell you something about these books and how they came to be and what they're trying to do. And the first in the series is a book that was published in 1998 by American IM John Watson, called Secrets of Modern Chess Strategy. It's one of our best-selling titles, and it won Book of the Year awards both in Britain and in the United States. It's hard to summarize a wide-ranging book like this in a short video, but I'll do my best. When you learn to play chess and you start to advance, you get bombarded by all kinds of principles. In the opening, knights before bishops, doubled pawns are bad, put your rook behind your passed pawn in the endgame, and all kinds of other, well, rules, principles, whatever you like to call them. And it's easy to get fixated on these principles. In fact, it would probably be better if they were called guidelines or hints rather than principles, because many of them have exceptions. And one of the problems is that when games are annotated, the annotator says, ah yes, black lost this game because he offended against such and such a principle. But what you don't learn is how universal a particular principle is. Does it apply just more than 50% of the time, most of the time, or almost all the time? And one of the reasons why master strength players are master strength players is that they have a much better idea of when you can ignore these principles, when they apply and when they don't apply. So although they know all these things and at the back of their minds, they are very flexible when it comes to implementing them. And if they feel it's the right thing to do, they'll completely ignore standard principles. Now, what John Watson does in this book is to go through all of these ideas and concepts which people tend to pick up as they improve and look at them critically. And the results are quite surprising. It's perfectly true that some of these principles are very, very useful. For example, the rook behind passed pawns in the endgame applies most of the time, 90% at least. So that's something that's really important to bear in mind. But there are some other principles. For example, it's generally, or it's often said, that queen and knight work better together than queen and bishop. And Watson analyses this statistically and finds a 53 to 47 advantage for the queen and knight. So yes, maybe there is a slight advantage, but it's one of those principles that has more exceptions than most. And all of these principles have exceptions to some degree, but some just have more exceptions than others. Well, the principle that I'm going to look at, and where John Watson gives a good example, is one that says you shouldn't open up the position when your opponent has the 2 bishops. Well, yes, there's a lot of logic in this. Bishops are better than knights in open positions, so if your opponent has 2 bishops and you have a bishop and a knight, or 2 knights, an open position will, in the majority of cases, favour the 2 bishops. But Watson points out that there are a huge number of exceptions to this rule, and this applies particularly to the openings. There are a lot of openings where one side or another gives up the 2 bishops. I can cite, for example, the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez or Spanish, the winner variation of the French, and of course the whole of the Nimzo Indian, or practically the whole of the Nimzo Indian. So in 2 of those cases, the compensation for giving up the 2 bishops is inflicting a doubled pawn on the opponent. But in the Nimzo Indian, that's not the case. So you might ask, well, of course, in some variations of the Nimzo Indian, the pawns do get doubled, but in many they don't. And you might ask, well, why is black giving up his 2 bishops for no visible compensation? And if you look back at games from, say, the 1950s, and you see a lot of wins by players like, say, Gigerich or Portish, you think, well, yeah, they exploited the two bishops very well. But it doesn't have to be like that. So let's look at this game, Kramnik Anand, and play over a few moves. It's an Nimzo-Indian. And white has played the Capablanca variation, which gets the two bishops without conceding doubled pawns. Well, what's the downside to this? It's a question of time. White has played two queen moves and the pawn move a3 in order to get the two bishops. Black, on the other hand, has got his knight out, his castles, and is all ready to develop his bishop to b7. And we can see an immediate impact of black's leading development is that it's slightly awkward for white to develop his king side now because of the pressure of the bishop on b7. So let's go a couple more moves. Okay, this is a way white can develop his king side without necessarily conceding knight e4 at some stage. The knight drops back to d2 so as to prevent the tactical trick with knight e4, which occurs in many Nimzo-Indian positions, and white intends to play f3 and e4, and the chain of pawns e4, f3, g2 will be a way of neutralizing the bishop on b7. It'll be a solid wall that's difficult to break up, and if white is allowed to complete this plan in peace, then he will have a clear advantage. He'll have a space advantage as well as having consolidated the two bishops. So white plays the next move of his plan, f3. And now black faces a critical decision. He has to do something quickly, and the only real thing he can do is to take some kind of action in the centre, either by playing d5 or c5 or both. Now this is where the principle comes in, or perhaps the lack of the principle. Both these moves, and particularly if black plays both of them, lead to a large-scale opening up of the position, something which theoretically favours the side with the two bishops, in this case white. But this ignores the question of time. Black has to do something quickly because of white's dangerous strategic plan. Opening up the position gives black more chance to put his leading development to use. So this is a kind of trade-off which you often get in chess. You concede one thing while gaining a compensating advantage somewhere else. Black can play c5 here, and Watson gives some analysis of that, but we're going to look at the move that was played in the game, which is d5. This is very logical because it prevents white playing e4, which is part of his plan, and then white has to be content with the more modest move e3. Still, given time, white's going to play bishop d3, castles, brings rooks to better squares, rook c1 for example, and once again the two bishops are going to start to play a part. So black immediately takes further action in the centre to exploit his leading development, and also the slightly awkward position of the white queen. If a black rook's coming to c8, the queen is going to feel rather uncomfortable on c3. Well, white here decided to take on c5, which is a concession because it gives up one of the centre pawns for a non-central pawn. But if white plays the alternative, namely bishop e2, black then can open things up, and then next move rook c8. He's got the white queen in an awkward pin, he's forced white to accept an isolated d pawn, and all in all, black can look forward to the future with some confidence here. Black is certainly equalised without too much difficulty. So that's why, in this position, Kramnik took. He avoids the isolated pawn in the centre of the board, but he loses part of his central control. But at least it allows him to continue his development, which he did. And once again, it's a case of if black doesn't do something fairly soon, make some kind of progress, get something to compensate for white's long-term advantage of the two bishops, then he may well find himself in some difficulty. So what Vishy played was expansion on the queen side. He intends to advance the pawn to a4, and that would fix the white b2 pawn as a backward pawn. So it's another one of these principles. Backward pawns are bad things, but in this case it has a lot of justification, because with the pawn on a4, black's able to bring his rook to b8 and exert quite awkward pressure against the pawn on b2, which is going to certainly tie down at least some of white's pieces. Another thing operating in black's favour here is that there's no really obvious way white can improve his pawn structure. He doesn't really want to exchange on d5 as well, because that would, well, in this position it would actually lose material after knight takes. There's a weak pawn on e3, so white is really restricted to a fairly quiet further development, which allows black to continue with his plan of making inroads on the queen side. So Kramnik decided to drop his bishop back so as to secure the slightly weak pawn on e3, and black continued with the plan. This position is about equal. Black has enough play on the queen side to compensate for the two bishops, and white has no effective way of changing the pawn structure in his favour. So now there ensues a period of quiet manoeuvring by both sides, which doesn't fundamentally change the structure of the position. Rook comes to a good square, and, well, white's put his rook on b1 as a kind of prophylactic measure to secure the pawn on b2. Black's bishop comes to quite an active square. Bishop drops back because white certainly doesn't want to allow black to take on d3, which would leave the queen in an awkward pin on this diagonal. And black is content now to play fairly flexibly. He now secures the pawn on a4, which wasn't actually under attack, but it might have been in danger at some point in the future. And to a large extent, he's just waiting to see what white intends to do. But as I said before, it is rather difficult for white to do anything constructive. There's no obvious way that he can change the pawn structure, and the bishops on f1 and f2 are not really pulling their weight and certainly pose no immediate danger to black. So this is a case where black's got a space advantage, he's got quite active pieces, and he's pinned down the backward pawn on b2. And all of this means that the two bishops, while they balance the black advantages, don't give white any advantage. So white just manoeuvres around. Black is content to repeat, and white tries to find some way to improve his position. The point of this move is white actually wants to play f4 without allowing the knight to come to g4. And f4 is a bit of a double-edged move, because it's not exactly what white wants to do, but if he wants to make progress, it's going to be quite difficult to do anything else. Well, here white continues with his plan to play f4, but in fact it doesn't give him anything. There's another possibility, which is to change the pawn structure by exchanging the centre and playing e4. After a few more moves, we again get a bishop versus knight position, but once again black doesn't have any real difficulties here. The active black pieces, and particularly this possibility of this knight coming to d3, balance the bishop versus knight advantage in this fairly open position. Both sides have slightly weak pawns, black's pawns are broken, white has a backward pawn. All in all, although this wouldn't have changed the balance of the position much, it might have been actually a slightly safer option for white to do this. Anyhow, white instead Let me just show you the move. White instead advanced his pawn, and this kind of forced black into a liquidation because he didn't want to retreat his knight passively. So a lot of things get swapped off now. And now again we have a bishop versus knight situation, but this doesn't look too great for white. His bishop is blocked in at the moment, and black still has this pressure against b2. Well, I think it's clear that white can't possibly claim any advantage in this position, but actually it's also not really better for black either. And after a few more moves, the players agreed to a draw. Let's just have a look at that. And black can now take on b2 with either the rook or knight, regaining the pawn, and, well, it's basically equal. Bishop has a decent square on d6, but the pawn at e5 is obstructing the bishop and is somewhat weak, so it's dead equal. So this is an example of how opening up the position can actually benefit the side which doesn't have the two bishops. Gain of time was important, the putting to use of a leading development, and, well, the slightly awkward position of the white pieces, particularly the queen on c3. So does this mean that these principles are of no value at all? Well, no, it doesn't, and Watson acknowledges that and gives examples in his book of cases where the principles are valid and where they're not valid. I like to think of them as guidelines, something you should think about and something you should bear in mind, but they're not cast in stone, and you should always keep in mind the flexibility to ignore the principles. One of the things I've found when helping out weaker players is that it's very difficult to get them to just look at the position. They want to play by these rules and principles that they've learnt, and to teach them not to do that and to look at the actual position in front of them is actually quite difficult. But it's an important lesson you have to learn if you want to improve. And I can recommend Watson's book. It's obviously 20 years old now, but still selling well. And it's an excellent way to take that next step forward. Once you've learnt the principles, you then have to learn to ignore them, at least in some cases. Well, thank you for listening to my video, and I look forward to seeing you for the next one.